So, oh, wait a second. Yeah, meeting is being recorded. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to UWA Anthropology Sociology Seminar Forum. Today, we welcome Reza Hasmath. But first of all, before Yutao introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Western Australia is situated on the land of the Wajak Noongar people. We acknowledge them as the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Yusau?
Yeah, thank you very much, Yutari. Can I start by joining Yutari to acknowledge the first Australians who really are the traditional custodians of this land. And it's my great honor to introduce my old teacher back in Oxford, Professor Reza Hasmath, to talk with us something that I understand is his sort of ongoing innovative project. Before I hand over the floor to Reza, I just want to briefly introduce Reza because Reza is truly, I think, how do you say? I think Reza's research agenda is truly multidisciplinary and multinational and very rich. And I know that he has held research and academic positions in many countries. Reza, don't be offended if I omit anything, but I do know that you taught in Melbourne, and you taught in Canada, probably different universities, Toronto, Alberta, and you, of course, you were one of my examiners of one of my milestone PhD project sort of examinations back in Oxford. And then Reza's research covers many different areas. The topic that made me know Reza was about the state-society relations in authoritarian regimes. Judging from the little chat that I had with Reza just before the talk, I think Reza's still doing research in that field in Poland at the moment. And then Reza also does research on ethnicity, and he has published amazing books and articles on the not religion, well, there are religious elements there, but ethnic education and other relevant topics in China. And he also does research on the different type of players which shapes international development. So today, I believe Reza is going to introduce to us about his new research, ongoing research about saying sorry, how states can effectively apologize, which is a topic, of course, I'm pretty sure will have profound theoretical implications, but also I think it's practically relevant to all of us. For example, in this country, I remember when I first visited this country back in 2010, 2011, that happened to be the week that Kevin Rudd made that, very powerful apology on behalf of the Australian government to the Aboriginal people. I think the legacy is still there. In my own country, China, actually, I was thinking, I've known Reza for about 8 years. And back in China, folks would say that's a very substantial period of time, long enough for Chinese to defeat the Japanese in the Second World War, right? That's how you say it. But even today, in the core of the Sino-Japanese relations is this sort of continued discussion and debate on whether or not the Japanese has already said sorry or were the way that they used to say sorry was that sincere enough. So I look very forward to Reza's new talk. And without further ado, I will hand the floor to Professor Hasmath.
Well, thank you, Utah, for your introduction. Thank you for the Anthropology and Sociology seminar coordinators for organizing this. And thank you all for coming today. It's 7 a.m. here in Warsaw, and I'm very happy to be here just to say a few words about apologies and state apologies in particular. Before I share my screen, I just want to mention that this is a joint project with a very good one of my best friends growing up. Actually, he was a economist, a behavioral economist, Benjamin Ho, and his work looks at how to apologize from an economic standpoint. In fact, if you ever take Uber, the sort of algorithm that Uber uses, uses his sort of work to say, what sort of apology should be given to you if Uber messes up. So we sort of try to bring that literature. My sort of background is in management and sociology and political science, and trying to bring some of those literatures as well into the forefront to try and understand what really is an effective apology. And in fact, an earlier version of this paper that I'm about to introduce was looking at corporate apologies as well. And it's like, how do corporations actually apologize properly? How do they go wrong? And we're trying to use some of those lessons learned there to try and apply it to institutional apologies or state apologies. So I'm going to look at three.
So I guess Reza is
Oh.
I just want to test is it a
I
problem
could-
or... Hi Reza, you were frozen a little bit. Do you want to go back a little bit and say that? So we already, I think, heard that this is a joint project, and then you did it with a friend who has an economic background. But from then on, I think, oh, he just gone.
He's gone, I
No,
think.
I'm still here. I'm still here.
Oh, great. Yeah,
what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my video off, and maybe it's easier for me for you guys to hear it that way. So what I was suggesting here is the sort of apologies I'm looking at. I'm going to look at Germany's apology, some of the classic apologies. I'll look at Germany's apology towards for the Holocaust. I'll look at Canada's apologies towards Indigenous communities there, which has a lot of parallels to the Australian case. And I would also look at South Africa's sort of apology there. There's a plethora of apologies I can also look at, but the point here is to show, what works and what doesn't work based on some of the literatures, and in particular, what are the effective ways to apologize. So if you cannot hear me, just Utah or one of the organizers, just say it by voice, and that way I can adjust to suit there. So I bear if there's any technical difficulties, I apologize in advance. Okay, so without further ado, let me launch into the conversation here. So the question I'm really asking here is, why do state apologize to a social group, especially when they face negative consequences for doing so? And when we look at the prevailing literature, it really suggests that the function of a state apology is to rehumanize the apologizer, that is the state, after they've committed a transgression and have been temporarily, shall we say, otherized in the eyes of the victimized party or the wider community. In effect, by apologizing, the state as a transgressor is attempting to redeem itself while restoring their trustworthiness. And in some rare cases, and so we were looking at so many different cases, but we did find that for the majority, it is really the state trying to rehumanize itself. There are some rare cases, however, where state apologies are employed to rehumanize the apologized by aiming to undo the damage caused by the act of dehumanizing an identifiable social group, whether these groups are refugees, indigenous groups, or ethnic minority groups. In these instances, really, you see that the state apology serves to bring voice and recognition to the grievances suffered by the apologized, even to the extent of, shall we say, perhaps psychologically healing the aggrieved individuals or social groups affected. Now, examples of apologies that at least partially address rehumanizing the apologized includes South Africa's apologies for apartheid and apologies offered to Indigenous groups in Canada. Now, this is not really to imply that such apologies serve no other purpose. In most cases, they did, but they are noteworthy for their focus on the apologized. In contrast, other state apologies, so example, is Germany's role in the Holocaust, have primarily been about atonement for the nation state. So similar to acts of ritual purification, the apology serves to cleanse the state and the people it represents, and in the process rehumanize them. Furthermore, in these cases, oh, I'm sorry. Sylvia, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, so what I was saying really was, In these cases, the grievances and I guess the trauma of the victimized party often remain insufficiently addressed as to meaningfully benefit them socially and psychologically. So at the end of the day, to best evaluate this sort of discord between state apologies aimed at rehumanizing the apologizer instead of the apologized, what I hope to do in this talk is really to bridge the insights on the literature about apologies, which have focused on how apologies function, and the literature on truth and reconciliation, which is focused on rehumanization. I'm going to engage in these following analytical queries. How are state apologies different towards a social group when the goal is to explicitly rehumanize the apologized, not the apologizer? What happens to the apologizer in such apologies? What can be learned by jointly considering the apology and truth and reconciliation literatures on how to make an effective apology? I will show that while state apologies often rehumanize the apologizer, paradoxically, an apology is only really effective if the intent is to rehumanize the victim, the apologized group. So here I'm going to talk about some of the frameworks and the sort of theoretical constructions, and then try to apply that to the case studies. So the conventional and popular understanding of apologies is relatively straightforward. An individual or a group commits a transgression, breaching the accepted societal norms or even laws of their community. And in doing so, trust is broken between the transgressor and the aggrieved party. Moreover, in some cases, the transgressor's social standing becomes diminished in the eyes of their community, potentially to the point of being ostracized. In an effort to repair this broken trust and potentially restore the reputation for trustworthy behavior, the transgressor really will apologize for their past actions. So one way to really conceptualize this, and this is coming from economics and behavioral economics rather, and management theory, is signaling theory. We can conceptualize the efficacy of apologies through signaling theory. Signaling theory is trying to explain how information between different parties in cases of information asymmetry is communicated or signal, and how that signal is interpreted. Now, in the context of this conversation, a transgressor's sort of apology signals your fitness to be restored to the in-group. More acutely, what I'm going to suggest here is that apologies signal two things. They are an acknowledgement of shared values and norms which the transgressor sort of violated through their action. And there's an implicit or an explicit promise that in the future their behavior will be different. Now, not all apologies are created equal, but what makes an effective apology that properly signals what it is intending to the receiver? And what makes these signals costly to the apologizer? Now, there's some consensus in the literature regarding the bare minimum elements for an apology to be successful. And in this slide, I talk about these four elements. The first is an acknowledgement of a wrong committed, including the harm that is caused. The second is an acceptance of responsibility for having committed the wrong. Third is an expression of regret or remorse, both for the harm and for having committed wrong. And finally, there's a commitment, explicit or implicit, to reparation and, when appropriate, to non-repeat of the wrong. We can frame these sort of guidelines here for best practices through an economic taxonomy of apologies, where the apologies of efficacy is measured by the cost associated with it. That is, and this is really key here, the costlier the signal, the more effective it's likely to be. And in other words, the more costlier the apology, the better it's often received by the group that's being apologized to. So there's a few sorts of things we can distinguish when it comes to apologies. There are tangible cost apologies, a commitment to improve conduct, a loss of status, an admission of incompetence, bypassing apologies, and partial apologies. So what I really want to focus on is the tangible cost apologies. And these are the tangible cost apologies are those that include either some sort of material restitution or exposes the transgressor to potential material liability. These apologies can include, for example, monetary reparations to the victims of past transgressions, or in some cases, their family members. Most commonly, reparations occur in state apologies, such as those given to living victims of residential schooling in Canada. Again, this will be a case study I'll be looking at in a few moments. Sometimes monetary reparations can compromise funds spent on community-wide social projects, such as those devoted to educating the public about a past transgression. Effectively, in this sort of apology, the apologizer is promising to do better in the future, and this can serve as an extremely effective signal. Implicitly, the apologizer is accepting that they will be held to a higher standard compared to those who did not apologize. That is, they're promising to do better, and it ups the ante for the apologizers in the future. And if they transgress, again, they can expect to be punished more relative to those who have not apologized. It can be aptly not, it can be applied, I guess, in a way that it's not just to the apologizer's exact transgression, but to all future transgressions affecting that same group. In other words, sorry, I'm seeing a chat here. Oh, okay. Um, sorry, it's just sometimes I need to go through screens, so I apologize for that. So really what I'm trying to say here in this framework is that promises to do better can be highly risky for state institutions if they cannot guarantee that transgressions will not reoccur. Now, with this framework in mind, I'm going to turn my attention to a few case studies. I'm going to divide the case studies between apologies that focus on the interests of the apologizer and those that focus on rehumanizing the apologized. So first, I'm going to start off by looking at a partial apology. And here I'm going to look at Germany and the Holocaust. And really, there's no conversation on state apologies that would be complete without mentioning this in some extent. Mentioning the Germany's apologies for the Holocaust committed during the Second World War. And in particular, I'm going to turn to our attention to West Germany's Chancellor Willy Brandt, who on December 7th, 1970, while visiting Warsaw, fell to his knees in front of the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, remaining completely still on the wet floor for over half a minute. Now, this apology, known thereafter in Germany as a knife fall, is notable for several reasons. Most significantly, it was the first time a German leader had so explicitly admitted responsibility and guilt for Jewish and Polish suffering. It is this recognition that Germany now shared social norms with their victims, norms that the Nazis had violated, which makes its apology much more about restoring the state's trustworthiness. This apology was a necessary action to restore the state to a position of trust. Perhaps one of the most unique things about Brandt's apology is that it was entirely unspoken. Therefore, it does not compromise the sort of four necessary elements of a complete apology I discussed in the framework, at least explicitly. Nevertheless, it's been recognized as a highly effective apology that helped to restore Germany's relations with its former victims, particularly Poland and wider Eastern Europe. Now, mind you, as I mentioned, I am in Warsaw and I am doing a lot of work on how Poland, receives apologies and so forth. And this is still a super contentious issue in the Polish sort of environment. But at the most basic level, we can suggest that it was an effective apology that began at the most basic level to restore Germany's relations with its bordering nations. Now here, there's a signaling taxonomy that's quite informative. While Brandt's apology was silent, it did implicitly contain the costly signal of status loss. Kneeling by its very nature reduces an individual's status in the eyes of those witnessing them. Moreover, the reaction of some German conservatives at home during that period, who questioned his patriotism and whether he should have knelt at all, signaled that Brandt paid a price for his actions. Now, In the paper, I discuss a bit more about this case study, but for brevity, I'm just going to continue on to the other two cases. And then and then I'm going to provide the lessons learned from these cases. And of course, I'll give you a link to the paper if you want to read more about these experiences here. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the South Africa case. And here we're going to say, this is one of the very few examples where the aim was, at least the intent was to rehumanize the apologized sort of communities. So South Africa really represents the most informative case study on the process of rehumanization, apologizing, reconciliation, and peace building in the wake of severe and prolonged injustice from a policy of apartheid. Now, with the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, one of the most pertinent questions was how to move forward. What was the best way to heal the grievous wounds of the past in a way that allowed for a new democratic, peaceful, and multi-ethnic South Africa? The choice was made to embark on an approach of restorative justice in the form of truth and reconciliation. This process invited victims who were recognized as having underwent gross human rights violations to supply statements about their experiences. The perpetrators of these acts were also given testimony and request amnesty for both criminal and civil prosecution for politically motivated crimes. It was through this process that the architects of the TRC hoped to heal the deep wounds of the past and rehumanize non-white ethnic groups who had suffered under apartheid. Now, the actual successes of the TRC are far much more muddled, with examples of both deep failures and some successes. One of the worst days of the TRC occurred when then President de Klerk apologized to the victims of apartheid on behalf of the National Party. And so in 1997, de Klerk was speaking to the TRC, responding to assertions expressing the country, insisted that he had previously apologized for apartheid. Now, de Klerk's apology was undermined because its mandate to speak on behalf of the National Party was extremely dubious. And it reflects the common difficulty in state apologies. That's to say, intergroup apologies are complicated since groups contain numerous autonomous agents who are capable of acting in distinct ways, even perhaps acting opposing the apology or the group receiving the apology. This can unsurprisingly serve to compromise the apology in the eyes of the recipient group and raise questions about how committed to reconciliation the sort of group truly is. It's worth reminding ourselves, I would suggest, that apologies need to be costly in order to rehumanize the apologizer. And so an apology made with this benefit, with the benefit to the apologizer, effectively lowers the cost of the apology, making the apology less credible and thus less effective. Now, while the function of an apology may be to rehumanize the apologizer, an apologizer that appears to be motivated by restoring the apologizer's status is likely to fail. A good apology has to focus on the victim. Now, that kind of seems normal. It kind of seems commonsensical if I say it in these terms. But when you actually see how apologies get transfused in the everyday globally, generally speaking, as I mentioned, the majority of apologies are it's about restoring trust in those who was the party who created that sort of action in the first place. So state apologies with a focus on rehumanizing the apologized may be more beneficial for the apologizer as well. Now, the third case that I'm going to talk about, and in the paper we look through other cases as well, but just for this talk, I'll look at this last case here. It's Canada and Indigenous residential schools. There's a lot of parallels between Canada's treatment of the Indigenous community and Australia's treatment of the Aboriginal community. So on June 11, 2008, then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the victims of residential schools. Residential schooling in Canada has had a long and tragic history, beginning as far back as the early 1600s with the opening of the first boarding schools. However, it really wasn't until the Indian Act of 1877, which made Indigenous peoples wards of the state, and the Canadian federal government responsible for their education, that the system truly took a sort of a negative effect. From 1867 to 1983, nearly 1/3 of all Indigenous children, approximately 150,000 in total, were taken from their families and communities and sent to these schools, which was funded by the state and presided over by churches. Now, the impact of this system, akin to Australia, continues to reverberate throughout the Indigenous communities, with prevalent research suggesting that there's a higher rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, mental illness, and suicide among Indigenous people in Canada. Now, in 2006, the government approved the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which included a payment, which included a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a health and healing services, and a commemoration. The federal government in Canada provided about 1.9 billion Canadian dollars, which is probably similar in Australian terms at this stage, to former living members of recognized residential schools, and it was intended to holistically address the experiences of attending residential schooling. Now, what I want to focus really is on the apology that was given. The actual apology offered in the Canadian Parliament is perhaps one of the best textbook apologies I've seen in the literature or in many of the cases. So the tone and substance of the apology was directly informed by letters from Indigenous groups, such as the Assembly of First Nations, and through meetings with survivors of residential schools. This can be understood as an important process in giving voice to the grievances of those who suffered by directly allowing them to have an influence in the tenor of the apology. Further, the government found a sort of a loophole that allowed Indigenous leaders to directly respond to the apology in the Canadian Parliament, instead of at a press conference as the government originally planned. So the apology was effusive, praising the strength of the Indigenous communities and apologizing profoundly for the government's role in the residential school system, as well as the damage it caused and continues to cause to Indigenous communities. Moreover, the Prime Minister directly referenced how the TRC was an opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential school systems. The apology contained all four of the elements as being necessary for a complete apology. Further, the apology contained costly signals. The tangible cost is evident as the apology followed on the backdrop of the substantive funding. Further, while not expressly promising to not repeat the act, the Prime Minister implicitly did so through his comments. It can also be inferred that the Prime Minister experienced some status loss through apologizing. For example, he actually praised his political rival and his ideological opposite for having spent the last year or two persuading the Prime Minister to apologize. Praising a rival leader in this manner caught many in the Canadian media by shock. This apology, while undeniably undertaking, is part of a, sorry, well, let me put it another way. This apology was a way to restore trust between the government and Indigenous communities, and also emphasize the rehumanization, or at least starting that sort of process of rehumanizing Indigenous communities. So what are the lessons learned? What are the key takeaways from this really brief presentation? Well, state apologies are typically about signaling trustworthiness. They're about restoring the apologizer, in this example, the state, to full standing within their community. I've argued that a restoration of trustworthiness is demonstrated by an agreement that what happened was a violation, an acknowledgement of shared values, and that the future will be better, and with that, a willingness to be held to a higher standard. Every state apology discussed today contained these elements to some extent. Now, the failure of apologies can be attributed to the reluctance of the apologizing parties to pay a real cost for their past actions, and an insufficient focus on the rehumanization of the victimized party. When considering state apologies that are effective, the more effective state apologies are those that are costly to fake. But differently, if the apologizer is sacrificing something to the apologized is more likely to believe the apologizer is being genuine. So we can delineate that an effective rehumanizing apology should, one, clearly identify the violation. 2, promise with clear language ways to make amends for the transgression, that it won't happen again, and an agreement to be held to a higher standard. 3, identify the reason for the failure and admit that it was a failure. And 4, avoid partial apologies that do not take responsibility for what has occurred. A state apology that does not have a guarantee appears to lack sincerity, since the apologizer is leaving open the possibility that they will commit future transgressions. There's also an inherent paradox to state apologies. While they only work if they are costly, an effective state apology that restores the transgressor to good standing effectively lowers the cost, making it easier to apologize. But another way, if the apologizer is more trusted by the apologized, the necessary costliness for a signal to be effective is lowered. So the lesson here is that the focus should be on rehumanizing the apologized social group, not the apologizer. Any state apology too focused on the apologizer is seen as self-serving and therefore less costly and less believable. The state apology focused on rehumanizing the apologized is therefore paradoxically more effective at rehumanizing the apologizer as well. So that's a sort of brief sort of spiel I have on how states can effectively apologize and, as the title suggests, have a long-lasting positive effect on the aggrieved party. Why don't I stop sharing my screen and start my video back again? As well as take a sip. So, at the end of the day, we're using a lot of the literatures, as I said, in management, in the economics of apologies, in sociology, and political science, to try and understand what makes a truly effective apology. Well, what's really shocking to me is that, and maybe to you as you hear this presentation, is that many of the things we're talking about, it seems so obvious that it has for an apology to be effective, it should be genuine. It should have a cost. It should be something that you're going to be held to a higher standard in the future. And it was very surprising that most state apologies do not contain these elements. And as a consequence, we still see these there's just lingering effects that we have of these apologies towards those affected groups, because the apologies generally are not super effective. So it's a really interesting sort of proposition there. I'm going to paste the, before we go to Q&A, so I'm just going to paste the papers link here, at least the working papers link. So you have an opportunity to look at it if you choose to. It's so I've listed it there. And if there are any questions or comments or feedback, I'll love to hear from you. Yes, Liz. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Chris Reza.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I was like Liz. I was like, wait a second.
I'm talking on my wife's computer because mine doesn't have a camera. Look, thanks for the presentation. I think it's really very relevant. And as you were speaking, I had memories of the apology that was made in the Australian Parliament by Kevin Rudd, our Prime Minister, for various transgressions, in particular for taking away what are called the stolen generation, Aboriginal people who were taken away from their parents and put into institutions in not exactly the same kind of way as Canada, but not too different either. And the apology was done by the Prime Minister, and it seemed to me to contain many of the elements that you outlined. In particular, to rehumanize the very large number of people who were paying attention, the Aboriginal people paying attention, but it seemed to me as though he stopped short of doing anything more than just saying we're deeply, deeply sorry, and that there was no real indication of reparation. In fact, it was made clear there should be no reparation. at least in the version he was doing. And I think because of that, it really fell flat. So that I think the construction of what you've put there is, I look forward to reading it, is really useful. Look, sorry about that introduction, but the part of the question I want to ask was, what about where the state is sort of represented in part, in the case of, say, where it's done something wrong to a particular group of people, but where it is not universal. I'm thinking about the presentation I gave last week in this series about Kakadu National Park, where the state has transgressed. And the minister, I think herself, has actually stood up and said, you know, we're sorry, but I think that probably isn't the end. And I suppose my question is it possible, therefore, for the state to be recognised in its small parts for the appropriate person, the minister in this case, to be making the apology?
So thank you for your comments. The first part about the Australia example I thought was quite apt. I was actually in Melbourne and Sydney as well during that period where Kevin Rudd did make his apology. And you're right, what's missing from that was a real cost to the Australian state. There was not that cost that's necessary for an apology to be truly effective. Mind you, there is an ongoing rehumanization, and it happens by just acknowledging, which we often do when we have presentations such as this, or any presentation or any sort of public gathering where we acknowledge that there is some past injustices there, but the cost was lacking, and you're perfectly right to suggest that. In terms of the state and the various parts of the state apologizing, what was really interesting is there has to be a consistent message by the various apparatus of the state. So I'm not fully acquainted with the example you provided, but from other examples that are very similar, if a minister apologizes, but the rest of the upper echelons of the government does not apologize or acknowledge it, or are not consistent, or there isn't a consistent sort of message there, the apology fails. It is not as effective. There has to be a consistent message. Now, of course, there's some issues with this because states are not a monolithic entity, and there's various parts. But the research has shown, and the evidence is quite clear about this, there has to be a consistent message. The messaging must be consistent, and in the absence of that, an apology is half-hearted at best, and it's not fully effective. And you see the receivers of those who are aggrieved generally don't trust that state or institution as much. So again, there has to be that consistency. And there I would suggest that the minister, if I'm taking my political science hat on or policy hat on, the minister should have a buy-in from whether it's the premier or whether it's the prime minister or whoever the leader is, and ensure there's that consistency throughout the ruling government or the institutions of the state.
Thanks.
I think we have the second question. I think it's Martin, but before that, before I forgot, I also apologize that Richard Fox, our discipline chair, sent his apology that he cannot come today. That's from me. Martin.
I wonder what the cost to Richard is for not coming here. That's it. Anyway. I'm interested in the temporal elements of this, Reza, as you were suggesting, that the business of there needs to be that sense of going into the future of good behavior. I just wonder the extent to which people who represent the state at the time they make an apology for a historical wrong, and some of it reaching back quite a long way, if it's felt at the time that that's the good behavior, that's the kind of appropriate form, especially when compared with what they're responding and reacting to in that historical way. And I will just point out, I've just put also a link to a program that was on the radio today that I think is really fascinating in terms of the ongoing work that has continued out of, the kind of impetus that something like the apology gave. but it also has to be seen, I think, alongside, in an Australian context, Paul Keating's moves towards native title with all this commonwealth. But I think it's really quite fascinating how things have developed as the states have responded in the Federation to some of that national signalling, if that's the way to put it. But the program is well worth, I think, tuning into, because it's looking at how the Northern Territory in particular is trying to set up, I would say, a pretty effective, it's trying to set up an effective response with all of the political compromises that are going to be there. Temporality, Reza, I didn't really mean to get caught up in that.
No worries. Well, thank you for setting that link. I'll actually look at it after this talk. I love the temporality, the sort of temporal sort of aspect. It's a tricky question because, I mean, on the one hand, you have to judge the apology within the sort of generation the apology is made. It has to be judged within the sort of societal norms at the time. On the other hand, I'm thinking about cancel culture. I'm thinking about, kinds of trends going on socially in many societies today, where they're judging the ills of the previous generations based on current day's sorts of norms and values. And that's a tricky proposition. Now, the paper doesn't really talk too much about that, but the advice that we do give is that you do need to be in the present. So if there is an apology, the apology must accord to the norms and values of today. Otherwise, the recipients, which are present today, are not going to interpret it within the terms that they should. In other words, you're not going to redeem yourself. But if you're looking at past apologies, and you try to judge it, shall we say, for lack of better terms, within today's sorts of norms and values, it is super tricky. And this is where the debates about cancel culture comes into play, where people are judging today's sort of past transgressions on the basis of today's norms and values. So it's a tricky one where I don't have a satisfactory response in how to analytically address that.
Sorry, I was muted. We have Lucas and then Sam. And then there's a question on the chat box. Lucas?
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I have so many questions, but I will just focus on one, which is, have you considered or have you included kind of class dimension to your analysis of apologizing? Because from my kind of family maybe perspective, Brand's kind of apology was really well accepted, but only by, let's call it like intelligence, while working class was actually thinking, well, what do actually we got from this? There was still actually present kind of resentment, and that Poland was betrayed by Western Europe, and oh, just the guy because he needs. What does it mean? My grandfather, who spent 1 year in Auschwitz, he got a bike as a kind of reward for being in Auschwitz, for helping local Jewish family. And for him, it was like a slap into face. Not only getting a bike from Western Germany, but at the same time, looking at this kind of symbolic, of course, a meaningful gesture, but for working class people, totally, meaningless. So I'm interested whether you thought or included kind of class dimension, and whether how the apology works for not like a general or generalized social group, but specifically a different class positions.
Well, thank you for that question, Lucas. I just turned my video off because my internet I had a message that said my internet was unstable. So I apologize. That's why I did that. It's a great question. As I said, I'm actually in Warsaw. I've been here for some time. And when I speak to people here about that, They may not put it as eloquently as you did, but there's a visceral negative reaction to Germany's apology, or lack thereof, rather. Among the intelligentsia, even, they said this was not a true apology. And so, on the one hand, and in the paper we sort of acknowledge it in passing, but we do need, as you're right, we should be a bit more aggressive in acknowledging the fact that the apology was a start. It did redeem Germany to some partners, and it's particularly at the elites, shall we say. But for the average citizen, there was not that. In fact, there's still negative connotations towards Germany and Poland right now. And in fact, amongst most, they believe that Germany never apologized. They never provided reparations to Poland. They never provided a meaningful sort of cost that you can equally suggest that this was actually an effective apology. So you're right, there should be a sort of intersectional analysis, which includes class. But again, the main point of the paper is just to show there are some key elements that are required at the most basic level for an apology to be effective. And in fact, it goes to the question in the chat that says, how do you assess the impact of state apologies? Well, I would do so by first and foremost ensuring that it's all the key basic elements are there. There's a cost. There is for instance, a true sort of promise that the state will do better in the future. And how do you assess that impact? Now, that's the question. That's a future-looking sort of assessment, whereby you hope that the trust has been mended. Trust is a mediating sort of element here. Now, in the Poland-Germany case, I'm just picking on Poland right now, when trust is restored fully, if you poll the everyday citizenry, if you look at it through either class, gender, or ethnic analysis, and you see there is trust for the German state, I would say that apology has long-term impact. At this juncture, though, that's not necessarily the reality.
Thank you.
Okay, I think next question, Sam.
Thanks, Reza. That was really interesting. I just had a question around, you mentioned the term rehumanize. So the implication is that the state dehumanized certain aspect or certain portions of its population or a specific group. Could you just say a bit more about the sort of implicated, like the theory of the human there? What does it mean to dehumanize? What does it mean to rehumanize? Is that the sort of experiential quantum that you're kind of undergirding this theory around? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for pointing that out. What's really interesting is really trying to understand, by dehumanizing and rehumanizing and rehumanizing sort of elements, it's just trying to bring to this conception that we don't really see this sort of humanity. Like and this is something to what the question that Lucas brought up, is that we don't, it's done in such a
Reza?
Okay, I think I'm back. I'm sorry. I apologize. Okay, let me start over again. So when we look at humanization, we often do not see the affected groups at their everyday. We see them in abstract terms. So if I'm looking at a policymaker, and I'm looking as an economist, I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis of the sort of apology that's being made. And so in this sense, where we say we need to humanize the group, the aggrieved group, is that we need to understand there's a tangible sort of impact at a very rudimentary human level, where these are individuals who have a psychological sort of issues or psychological break that requires trust being restored. So humanization and rehumanization in this sort of context means that you're trying to develop and reinvigorate that sort of trust at a very individualized level, rather than what the policymakers are generally guilty of is treating that individual in a very meta sort of group level sort of analysis. So it's really trying to suggest that there are stories to be told and stories to be understood that go beyond just simply having an institutional apology. So it's really trying to bring it back to a very, I guess, grassroots, minute level that we're looking at individuals who have been affected. Now, I am completely aware there's a literature, a strong literature, in fact, about humanization, rehumanization, and talks about humanizing in particular for immigrant groups and migrant groups, and looking at how, again, when we are formulating policies, we generally don't see them as an individual, as a human being. We see them as a group. We see them as a cost benefits of analysis, and it's moving away from that apologies must be personalized. It's about the personalization of the apology that matters a lot, and has to do with trust. It's about restoring broken trust. So there's a lot of things that's embedded within that sort of conversation there, and that can be an entire paper or two or a book looking at humanization, rehumanization. And that's something that we're trying to explore a bit more and delve greater into.
I think there's a follow-up question on that, the impact of state apology in the chat.
So the question is, so if you don't have a measure of how the state apology impacts the victims, how do you support the claim that apologies that rehumanize the victims are actually better in any significant way? Well, it's about, I mean, this goes back, it's a paradoxical question, because in order to humanize the victim, part and parcel of that is to not use traditional sort of cost benefit analysis to analyze in a measurable fashion that they are being, in a very quantifiable way, being significantly better off. What I can say is there's trust in the theory that an apology, when we look at institutional sort of apologies, when we look at business apologies, that when you do apologize, this is what's seen as effective insofar that there isn't a negative, insofar that there's trust being restored. Apologies is about restoring trust at the most basic level. If trust is restored, that's one way to measure it if you really want to look at a measurement sort of level there. So if the question then says, if you don't have a measure of how state apology impacts the victims, how do you support the claim? You support the claim by virtue of showing trust levels have increased. That's how you would do so, if you really want to look at it from a political science standpoint. From a sociological standpoint, or perhaps some anthropological stance, you would see whether or not individuals can participate and have a meaningful life.
Okay. More questions? I have a question. Reza, from the case studies, I mean, I'd like to know, because like in Indonesia, we also have this discourse on the state apologizing to the citizens back to 1960s, where there's a huge conflict with the Communist Party. And then the idea has not been realized until now. So I want to know, in the case studies that you research, I'm sorry if I a bit missing your explanation before, but what kind of events or discussions or those sort of things that lead to the decision of the state to apologize?
I'm sorry, my sound went off. This is like the worst possible scenario where you have connection issues. I hate this. Okay, do you mind just saying the first part of your question? I apologize profusely for that again.
Yeah, that's okay. So I just want to know what kind of situations that at that point lead the states that you mentioned in your talk to apologize, because I'm trying to put your talk into Indonesian situation. Like back in my country, the idea of apologizing to the former Communist Party members is just not there. So
I would like to suggest, I would like to ideally think that we have an environment where the state realizes its transgressions, apologizes, makes amends, but that's not necessarily the reality. Generally speaking, these apologies come because there's been a concerted effort by whether civil society groups, by the communities at large to name and shame the state. Now, remind you, if you look at these examples, most of these apologies came long after the fact, after a long and arduous campaign. For the Germany one, it was 1970, World War II ended in 1945. For the Indigenous groups in Canada, that came almost 3 decades after the fact, after the schools were abolished. These are when we look at these apologies, and South Africa was probably one of the fastest ones, because it's so egregious that so what sparks the state to actually apologize? There are three things. One, legal challenges, and so in many jurisdictions, a state refuses to apologize because it knows once it apologizes, it admits that it has guilt, which requires reparation payments. And so that's one of the major issues here. So it's a legal explanation. The second explanation is looking at community groups and civil society actors naming and shaming the state. The third one is there's a shift in norms and values where you find that the general population, where something is so egregious that they are calling for, when there's consciousness of the action, rather, they're calling for an apology. But for the most part, there's a major lag in pretty much all apologies, state apologies, that is. When it comes to business apologies or corporate apologies, there's also a lag, but it's only when it's their bottom line is being affected. So in an earlier version of this paper, we look at Exxon Valdez. We looked at a lot of corporations and their misgivings and their issues that they had. And it only came because their bottom line was being affected. And so, there isn't that sort of direct sort of implications for states, because states do not have that profit motive, where their longevity is not going to be risked, their survival is not going to be risked if they don't apologize. So I would say it's those three elements I mentioned: the legal, the sort of naming and shaming, as well as looking at how how the state through the general population, their norms and values shift.
thank you, Reza. Okay, it's 3 o'clock now. Do you have any more questions? I haven't seen any blue hand raised, but
Hi, Ulrich.
Okay.
Can I just have a very quick question, Reza? Yep. You don't have to answer this because we are at the end of the talk and we can talk later. I was just thinking from a methodological perspective, and this is probably relevant to the previous question sent it to you by the test. Are there exceptions? Like, are there apologies made in the ways that you suggested, like cover these 4 elements, but they are not received very well? Or I mean, have you come across? Have you done any comparative studies also include, for example, the negative cases? Because all your 3 cases, I think they're positive cases in a way. I do know there's some paradoxes there, because there's a moral dimension and there's a rejection of the, sort of cost benefit calculation. So the paradigm there probably is not entirely sort of positivism, but nevertheless, I was just thinking, have you studied any negative cases as well?
Well, interestingly enough, the majority are negative cases. The majority are failures of apologies. When we started off this project, we went through so many apologies, and it was shocking how very few apologies are actually that are successful. And again, the question asks, how do you judge success? Well, success is that you're restoring trust, or you're on the way to restoring trust. And it goes back to Benjamin, my friend Ben's, who's a co-author on this paper, his sort of analogy when we look at Uber. If Uber messes up, the reason why you go back to Uber is that they apologize in a monetarily fashion, but also it restores your trust in Uber. So restoring trust matters so much. And you find that, when it comes to state apologies, they seldom restore trust. And if you look at the Aboriginal situation in Australia, there's still a massive distrust between the Aboriginal community and the state. And so in that instance, I would not say it's successful, but at least the conversation towards reatoning trust is there. Same we had held true for the Canadian example as well.